So the Senate has kind of been surprising me a little bit lately, both for good reasons and very bad reasons. But first, let's get to the good. They recently adopted Bernie Sanders' resolution to end U.S. support for Saudi genocide in Yemen. They also unanimously passed an anti-lynching bill, and they recently passed bipartisan criminal justice reform. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bipartisan? That's got to be bad, right? Because even if bipartisan isn't inherently bad, well, it doesn't really mean the same thing it used to mean. I mean, before, bipartisan legislation was an example of the children's health insurance program. But now, whenever there's bipartisan reform of any sort, I usually just have this visceral aversion to it because it usually means that we're getting screwed over by both parties. But when it comes to criminal justice reform here, it's actually a solid step in the right direction. Now, as German Lopez reports, the Senate on Tuesday passed a criminal justice reform bill in an 87-12 vote, overwhelmingly approving the biggest changes to the federal criminal justice system in decades. The bill, known as the First Step Act, will take modest steps to alter the federal criminal justice system and ease very punitive prison sentences at the federal level. It would affect only the federal system, which, with about 181,000 imprisoned people, holds a small but significant fraction of the U.S. jail and prison population of 2.1 million. Essentially, the bill will allow thousands of people to earn an earlier release from prison and could cut many more prison sentences in the future. Now, all Democrats supported this, but there were some Republicans who opposed it. But for the most part, they were defeated, and the individuals who were cheerleading this bill, which surprisingly was Chuck Grassley and Cory Booker, I believe they were actually the two sponsors of this bill, they got it through, and it's a really solid step in the right direction. It doesn't go as far as it needs to say the least, but it's still a good first step, and this will be a positive force in the United States, who has the highest incarceration rate per capita in the world. Now, what specifically does this bill offer? So the major provisions are as follows. The bill will make retroactive the reforms enacted by the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which reduced the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentences at the federal level. This could affect nearly 2,600 federal inmates, according to the Marshall Project. The bill would take several steps to ease mandatory minimum sentences under federal law. It would expand the safety valve that judges can use to avoid handing down mandatory minimum sentences. It would ease a 3 strikes rule, so people with 3 or more convictions, including for drug offenses, automatically get 25 years instead of life, among other changes. It would restrict the current practice of stacking gun charges against drug offenders to add possibly decades to prison sentences. All of these changes would lead to shorter prison sentences in the future. The bill would increase good time credits that inmates can earn. Inmates who avoid a disciplinary record can currently get credits of up to 47 days per year incarcerated. The bill increases the cap to 54, allowing well-behaved inmates to cut their prison sentences by an additional week for each year they're incarcerated. The change applies retroactively, which could allow some prisoners, as many as 4,000 according to supporters, to qualify for release the day that the bill goes into effect. The bill would allow inmates to get earned time credits by participating in more vocational and rehabilitative programs. Those credits would allow them to be released early to halfway houses or home confinement. Not only could this mitigate prison overcrowding, but the hope is that the education programs will reduce the likelihood that an inmate will commit another crime once released, and as a result reduce both crime and incarceration in the long term. There's research showing that education programs reduce recidivism. So these all seem like fairly solid, albeit incrementalist steps in the right direction. I like that they're trying to both reduce prison time, and also they're trying to tackle the recidivism rate. So, I mean, it's better than nothing, right? This isn't sweeping reform, but it's still very positive. Now, what should be added to the bill? Well, Bernie Sanders points out, I'm glad that the First Step Act passed, but there is much more needed to achieve comprehensive criminal justice reform. We must end cash bail and private prisons and mandatory minimums, reinstate the federal parole system. Our primary goal must be rehabilitation, not punishment. And that's just it. I think that if you really change the way that we approach criminal justice in the United States, the impact could be profound. We need to focus on rehabilitation and not punishment. So this is absolutely a positive step in the right direction, and it's one of the reasons why the Senate has kind of been surprising me lately, although with good also comes bad, because this is America and our politicians don't represent us. So since Donald Trump announced a withdrawal of troops from Syria, there has been a lot of outrage from senators who are trying to stop him from doing that. This includes Lindsey Graham, among some Democrats as well. But additionally, something that's really nefarious that they're doing, specifically that Democrat Ben Cardin and Republican Rob Portman are doing, is they're desperately trying to sneak their anti-BDS legislation into a spending bill at the very last minute. And while it's not as draconian as its worst iteration, which actually called for jailing people who participate in BDS, which is just laughable, I mean, it's still unconstitutional nonetheless. It imposes criminal and civil penalties for BDS activists. And it may very well be the case that by the time you see this video, this either passed or was defeated, but thankfully, there's a little bit of pressure from leftists on these lawmakers because this absolutely cannot go through. We live in a country where the First Amendment says that the government is not allowed to penalize individuals that express freedom of speech. And this couldn't be a more brazen violation of the First Amendment. In fact, if this passes, this would be a quintessential example of a violation of the First Amendment. And I have got to give a shout out to David Doel, who made a really phenomenal video about how lots of states are actually imposing these laws where they're making, I believe, state-level workers sign contracts agreeing that they won't participate in BDS. I'll link to it down below so you can get the full scoop, because I don't want to butcher this story because it's really important. But one teacher was fired because she refused to sign an anti-BDS contract, and the individuals who claim to care about BDS, or no, they don't claim to care about BDS, they claim to care about free speech, rather, like Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin, they've been silent about this. So this is something that we absolutely have got to defeat, and as Emma Vigeland pointed out on Twitter, any Democrat who supports this has got to be primaried, because this is absolutely unacceptable. So with some good comes some bad. We got fairly solid criminal justice reform. We got the Senate voting to approve Bernie Sanders' bill that would withdraw U.S. support for Saudi's genocide in Yemen, but at the same time, they're trying to push this anti-BDS legislation on us and sneak it in to a spending bill because they know that that's the only way they can get it passed. So, I mean, it's a mixed bag, but for the most part, at least we're getting some good things, I guess, as opposed to just all negative all the time.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.